Alright, I've hit record, and today I'm going to talk about the Minnesota Vikings until I have nothing left to say. As most of you know, I am a Minnesota Vikings fan, but I don't talk a lot about the NFL season here on the channel. When I stream, I get questions, and I love going back and forth talking about what I think about different teams or my favorite team, the Minnesota Vikings. I don't know how long this is going to go. There's a lot I want to dive into. I'll have some gameplay in the background, a Vikings-Bears game that is going to be the season finale. But as far as I'm concerned, this year is already over. I'm not ready for a 17th game of Vikings football this year. 7-9 this year is enough. And I don't mean to get hyperbolic here in the first minute of the video, but this is perhaps my least favorite year of watching the Minnesota Vikings. It's the, 20th season I've watched. First year I watched was Dante Culpepper's first year starting. That was back in 2000. And while other Vikings teams have been worse, just worse teams, this is by far one of the most frustrating teams I have ever seen. Just because when you factor in expectations and you factor in how long the head coach has been here and where the team has been, combined with perceived quality of the roster, this season, by all accounts, is a colossal failure. There's a ton of blame to go around with why the Vikings are at this point. So let's just start to dive into this season a little bit here and what I thought about the team coming in. Obviously, the 2020 season was very difficult for all teams. The Vikings dealt with a number of defensive injuries last season, and it was the worst defense in the Mike Zimmer era. Although, in the middle of the year, they were able to figure some things out. They had a big win on the road against Green Bay and eventually got themselves into the playoff conversation right about the time they lost a late season game to the Cowboys and Alvin Kamara had a 6-touchdown game on Christmas against them. The Vikings then knew they had to make changes in the offseason and were very busy in free agency, bringing in Patrick Peterson, Dalvin Tomlinson, and trying to make sure what happened a year ago never happened again. The Vikings, as they tend to do, had a good offseason on paper and looked like they were at least going to be a better team than a year ago. And I will say I think this is a better team, but the difference doesn't really matter. I expected this Viking team to be in the playoff conversation and to go 10-7. I felt like when you look at the playmakers on offense, Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, if they could just get the defense to being average this year, I felt like they were easily at least a lower tier wild card team. And you know what? That prediction wouldn't be too bad if they just could go 500 in these ridiculous games that always go down to the wire. It's been such an exhausting season with every game almost going down to the wire. The Vikings, up until the Rams game this year, had a 7-point lead at one point in every single game until that Rams game. A big home game that could have really helped save the season, and they didn't really show up for it. I'm skipping some stuff here. There's a lot to get into before this Rams game. But basically, I thought the Vikings looked terrible in the preseason. Wasn't really sure, how they would start the year, but still felt like they were really talented. I, believe in Mike Zimmer as a coach, especially a defensive coach, and getting that at least back to being average. And I thought they were going to start this year by beating the crap out of Cincinnati. I thought it was going to be like the San Francisco game in 2018 when everybody had crowned Jimmy Garoppolo after 5 games the year before, and the Vikings were his real first tough challenge as a starting quarterback, and he played a very bad game in that week 1. I wanted something like that with Joe Burrow coming off the ACL and a lot of people really high on the Bengals offense, and I wasn't so much then. Didn't really think they had the coaching. I thought there was a lot of good talent, but no offensive line. I just felt like the Bengals weren't going to be a great team. And now I love watching them play, and they're, of course, AFC North champions, and now I think they have a legitimate chance to go to the Super Bowl. I really do, the way they're playing right now. But back in that week 1 game, I thought the Vikings would come in with this reconstructed defense and a lot of playmaking, talent on offense, and at least score a road win. And I had to wake up, on the first drive of the year when they got called for 3 false starts and a holding penalty. And I'm telling you, from that drive until now, late in the season in January, I don't think the Vikings have improved as a football team. I think they're the same team they were back in week 1. They ended up losing that game in overtime. I don't think Dalvin Cook was down. It doesn't matter at this point. They blew that game against Cincinnati. Go into Arizona the next week, go toe-to-toe with that offense. Really entertaining game. Missed a 33-yard field goal at the very end. And honestly, by then, I was checked out. Missed the field goal, as they always do. Blew the game against Cincinnati. Looks like they had a tough schedule on paper. The rest of the way, like, the entire year, I felt like the Vikings schedule was brutal with very few breaks or matchups that seemed easy. And the Vikings showed that nothing was going to be easy for them this season. So I really, after 2 games, I had already thrown in the towel. They already blew 2 games that they could have won. They should have beaten Arizona. And Seattle was the next week, man. And they had lost to Seattle every year since like '08. Every year. I don't know how the schedule ends up where the Vikings go on the road to Seattle and lose every time. I still remember that massive Doug Baldwin game a few years ago. And of course, you got the primetime game last year with DK Metcalf catching the game winner. Well, it turns out Seattle's an even greater mess than Minnesota this year, and the Vikings actually beat them pretty handedly. That was maybe their easiest game of the season, and Seattle was not very competitive. That was also the first game in a 3-game homestand for Minnesota, a chance to bounce back from those early losses, and they just beat Seattle. Cleveland was the next game, and this is where the problems really showed up with the offensive coaching, I feel, because the Vikings, they had an impressive opening drive, went down, scored a touchdown, and it was the last time they scored the entire game. This year's offensive coordinator has been Clint Kubiak. After Gary Kubiak, his father, was the offensive coordinator last year, and then he retired. I think what we found this year is that he was probably named the offensive coordinator and play caller a bit too early. Zimmer wanted to keep the same scheme on offense, and some continuity would be nice with all the offensive coordinator changes this team has had over Mike Zimmer's entire time with Minnesota. So I understand it from that standpoint, but I just don't think he was ready to be a play caller. The play calling to me has been incredibly vanilla. It's been very predictable. And outside of like the scripted start to games, it's been an uphill battle the entire year. The beginning narrative early on was that the Vikings had no second half offense because, well, they didn't. They scored, like I said, once in that Cleveland game, and continuously they'd build up these leads early in the first half, and then in the second half they couldn't do anything. They weren't able to adjust. They just weren't able to move the ball with an offense that had Dalvin Cook, Justin Jefferson, and Adam Thielen. It is the most frustrating thing to watch them start the game strong and try to set the tone and then not be able to follow it up. The Cleveland game dropped Minnesota to 1-3, and it was another classic game. Like, the problem too is here in the Mike Zimmer era, he's been with the Vikings since 2014. A lot of these games follow the exact same template. And the Browns game was the template the Vikings usually display against Chicago, where they lose the battle up front, Kirk Cousins can't overcome it, and the day is over. There is no plan B in these kinds of games where the Vikings are so overwhelmed and just keep going 3 and out, try to establish the run. That's not going to happen. And I know when I talk about this team, especially over recent years, I just sound like I'm saying the same things every year. But for much of this Mike Zimmer era, the Vikings have had a bottom 5 offensive line that has lost them so many games and has ruined the flow of the offense. And the funny thing is here in 2021, I really don't think the offensive line was a big problem compared to years past. There are games they did not play well and were, should get a lot of the blame for why they lost. And the Cleveland game is certainly one of those games. They just had no answer up front. The Vikings draft a lot of these athletic linemen that aren't very big, and they get overwhelmed by power. And so the middle of the pocket is always collapsing, and you got a quarterback who has no ability to get outside the pocket, make anything happen, and he doesn't play well under pressure to begin with. Now, the offensive line, I'm not calling them good this year, but I don't think they're bottom 5. They're probably now more like, they're closer to middle of the pack, but they're still below average to me. But I think they're the big reason for one of the Vikings' greatest weaknesses this year, which has been their third down play. They're 28th this year in converting third downs, and I don't know the average, distance to go, but the Vikings are tied for second in holding penalties this season. They can't win on first down running the ball the way Mike Zimmer wants to. And I know Zimmer's an old school coach who wants to run the football, and you know what? He would probably do a much better job if he were with the Cleveland Browns and had that offensive line at least. The Vikings just cannot do it. They get pushed around too much. They have too many runs that go for 0 or negative yardage. I said this on Twitter the other day. The Vikings are a great example of the difference between having a good running game and a good running back. That's all the Vikings have, is a good running back in Dalvin Cook. They're not actually a good running team. If that were the case, they would be better on first down. They convert third and short. They'd run the ball better in the red zone. Thankfully, they've been a good red zone team, honestly, because that's where Kirk Cousins plays really well. He's thrown a red zone touchdown maybe every single game this year. I know that was true for the first 11, 12 games of the season, but Cousins is good in the red zone. I think he's very good down there. But anyway, after their 1-3 start, they almost blow a game against Detroit that could have had Mike Zimmer fired, possibly. If they were 1-4, that was the game where Greg Joseph nailed that long field goal to win it at the end of regulation, and it was the most hollow-feeling, worthless win I think they've ever recorded in my time as a fan. Yeah, he won the game with a 54-yard field goal, but the fact it even came down to it said way more about this team. Sure, the Vikings got their second win, but I think we all knew, this isn't a team that can go to the playoffs if this is how they're going to win games. And they go on the road the next week to Carolina, put up a big lead. Carolina's probably on the verge of putting in P.J. Walker for a majority of the fourth quarter, and the Vikings defense just collapses, lets them come back. Darnold forces overtime. Cousins goes down, wins the game on the walk-off to K.J. Osborne, who has been one of the great stories to come out of this 2021 season. He's one of the young players they've drafted recently who has actually developed. And we'll talk more about Rick Spielman's drafting here very shortly. So that win was the Vikings getting back to 500 the first time. Because after a bye week, they played the Cowboys on Halloween, and boy, was that scary. First of all, the Vikings coming off the bye, that doesn't mean anything. They never come out more prepared, more anything. It's not like Andy Reid's team's coming off a bye at all. So that's one more thing that's annoyed me throughout this Mike Zimmer era. But, you lose to Cooper Rush in primetime. Everybody's watching on Halloween. You put up 16 points. Very embarrassing game for the Vikings. After that, they took on Baltimore. That was another overtime loss, and they should have won that game. They got a big turnover off Lamar Jackson. Didn't matter. And so they were, again, 2 games under 500. And what do they do after that? the Vikings just always seem to find their equilibrium as they beat the Chargers in a game where I'm like, this is going to be weird. You got two teams that always go down to the wire, can't kick field goals, and it was a very just like average NFL game. And the Vikings won it 27-20, and it wasn't as dramatic as 12 of the other games on the schedule. Can't believe it. Week 11 was the apex of the Vikings season, which is when they took on Green Bay at home, and I thought that was a quality win for them because the Vikings are no longer a defensive football team. They're just not good enough, and we knew that by now. Like, they were supposed to be this team that could stop the run because they had Michael Pierce and Dalvin Tomlinson. Yeah, they weren't any good at stopping the run, and they haven't been for most of the year. But the Vikings are an offensive team whose offense traded punches with Green Bay, and after a big touchdown to Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Kirk Cousins was able to get the offense down the field again to set up a game-winning field goal. They won that game. They were 5-5, 500 for the second time. And then they go on the road to San Francisco, and Elijah Mitchell runs through the defense, and the 49ers win 34-26. Deebo Samuel had some great plays in there. And then they go against Detroit. They got to go down to the wire once again. And Jared Goff throws the game winner to Amon-Ra St. Brown, and that really catapulted his tremendous close to the year. One of the better rookie receivers. They lost to the Lions on the last play, man. And I was waiting for them to lose again against the Pittsburgh Steelers on Thursday night. And they played their most dominant half of football the entire year. And then proceeded to almost blow one of the biggest leads in NFL history. The Steelers were one knocked out pass by Harrison Smith away from scoring that tying touchdown. They would have needed the 2-point conversion. But again, the Vikings didn't have the ability and haven't had the ability throughout the last 4 years to simply beat a team thoroughly. And look, the Vikings are not a top-tier team, but they're better than a lot of teams, and they should be able to have a couple games a year where they just dominate an opponent. The Seattle game was, I think, the closest we got to that. Although the offense, the Vikings are a team who still lets up when they have a lead. They are. Against the Chicago Bears, the next game, Monday Night Football, 17-9. A game so entertaining, I was doing the dishes and working on cleaning up the kitchen because all the Vikings were doing was saying that leading by 17-3 was enough. And they were just going to run, pass, punt their way to a win. And it worked because Chicago's offense wasn't very good that night, and the third quarter alone probably should have had Matt Nagy fired on the spot because the Bears were imploding with penalties, extending drives, and big mental mistakes. Their win against Chicago was another win that really just felt empty. It wasn't a win that said, yes, this is a team that's gotten better, a team that has a chance to go to the playoffs. This team was not able to get me like they have in recent years, to buy in. I guess after the Packer game, I felt like maybe. They were 5-5. Pittsburgh game got them to 7-7 the third time back to 500. If they had beaten Pittsburgh more thoroughly, maybe. But against the Rams, I again had pretty low expectations, and unfortunately they were met. They, made it a 7-point game at the end, but honestly, the Rams dominated that game. And then we have the most recent one, of course, the Sean Mannion experience. Always a fun time. 37-10, Green Bay wins that one. They won very easily. So here we are with the Vikings at 7-9, which was the same record the Vikings had the first year with Mike Zimmer. It's the record they had last year with Mike Zimmer. And now we have just one more game before this era likely comes to an end. And it is time. I do think that Mike Zimmer should be fired after this year, but I don't think he should be alone. With every organization, you have to look at who's calling the shots in terms of the general manager, head coach, and the starting quarterback. And I'm not all that fond of any of those three right now with the Vikings. And the thing is I think Mike Zimmer's a good coach. I think Rick Spielman is a good GM, although he's not put together a great track record in recent years. And I think that Kirk Cousins is a good quarterback, but he's not good enough to be paid what he is. And I don't think that the team rallies around him, believes in him, and he's the type of quarterback that can take any team to a Super Bowl. I don't think Kirk Cousins can take you to a Super Bowl. I think you have to take him the way Jared Goff and Jimmy Garoppolo have played in Super Bowls recently, and they didn't win them. And they didn't get there with $45 million cap numbers, which is what Kirk Cousins may have next year. And that's going to make it a lot more difficult to consider moving on from him. And now, just over the years, you get to know the team pretty well. You can't necessarily quantify it or give a lot of statistics. A lot of it is just, dude, trust me. But my feeling right now with the Vikings is that there's going to be a little less change than some of us want. I am confident in Mike Zimmer no longer being the head coach. Back-to-back 7-9 seasons. I don't think the team has given up on him, but I also don't think that they're this tough, well-coached, quality team. They can't finish out games. They're incredibly inconsistent. They play under their talent level. They're really riding the reputation of defenses past. And I think especially when you look at how this Vikings team has become an offensive football team and how far the defense has fallen behind, Zimmer's a great defensive coach, but he isn't showing it this year, even. I know that there's still some problems with this defense. Danielle Hunter has been hurt. They're playing backup defensive ends. They don't have great corners. And to me, that falls on both Spielman and Zimmer because the draft picks and the free agents have not been great. I'm guessing that Mike Zimmer has a lot of say or influence as to which corners are added, as that's usually his specialty. But the draft picks haven't been very good, and they haven't been developing. I mean, Mike Hughes is in Kansas City now. Jeff Gladney didn't look very good before the Vikings released him this year. And you look at some of the free agent moves at the same time. Bashaud Breeland came in, did not play real well. I mean, I'll give you Patrick Peterson, but you also paid him $10 million to really just be an average corner. And he stayed on that right side of the defense, and you got all these quarterbacks who are better throwing to the opposite side regardless, the offense's right-hand side, and that's what teams have done all year. Oh, you got Devontae Adams being covered by Chris Boyd, and they just made it look so easy on Sunday night. There's a lot of blame to go around here with why the Vikings are in this situation right now, but I think regardless, both Spielman and Zimmer have got to go. A lot of Vikings fans have been critical of Rick Spielman throughout his time as GM. It wasn't until last year that I had really had enough. With the way the Vikings went into 2020, so ill-prepared in their secondary. They came in, played all these rookies. Cameron Dantzler was out there, and by the end of the year, he was playing decent. I think maybe he regressed a little bit this year. But they had a bunch of rookie corners going into 2020. No veteran presence. And they decided that was good enough. When you open the season at home in an empty building against Aaron Rodgers, who can probably whisper audibles and little calls out to Devontae Adams, it was so quiet in there. And then they also had to play Phillip Rivers, Ryan Tannehill, Russell Wilson in the first 6 weeks of the season. And they were 1-5 or something. I'm yeah. You need to be fired for that. You put together a team that had no chance of being competitive, and you were wrong. But everybody stayed around, 2020, throw it away, weird year, come back 2021, reload the team, and I felt like they would be better. And them not being better means everybody's got to go. And especially now we can look back with the way things have unfolded, And Rick Spielman has not done a good job ever since the 2017 NFC Championship game. I'm looking back at the draft history, and sure, you got hits like Dalvin Cook in 2017. He tore his ACL early and wasn't a part of the long run that year. But of course, the Stefon Diggs situation led to the Vikings getting Justin Jefferson, and they were so fortunate for that. You end up trading away a top caliber receiver for a top caliber receiver. It never works out that way. The Vikings got lucky like they rarely ever do. And Spielman's had some impressive draft picks over the years. Danielle Hunter, that was a great example of getting him in the 3rd round and having Andre Patterson, a fantastic defensive line coach, help develop him into one of the NFL's better edge rushers. There's Eric Kendricks, who's become such a great player. Harrison Smith, drafted back in 2012. The problem is you didn't do anything else in the last 4 years. When you look at the Vikings draft history, I'm not kidding here when I say the Vikings haven't drafted an average defensive starter in the last 4 years. That sounds impossible, especially when you consider the fact the Vikings always make like 10 picks, sometimes 14 or whatever it was back in 2020. And now that I'm going through this a bit further, like the Vikings have drafted terrible on defense since 2015. That is when they got Trey Waynes, who at least was decent. They followed that up with Eric Kendricks and Danielle Hunter and Stefon Diggs, and that was a signature draft for Rick Spielman, and it was one of his last decent drafts. He's been wasting 1st-round picks when the Vikings were supposed to be at their peak in this era. And like I said, he hasn't drafted an average defensive starter in at least 4 or 5 years. I think maybe you give him some credit for Mackenzie Alexander being an okay slot corner at times. But I mean, come on. Other teams make this look pretty easy. Other teams can draft a guard in the 4th round, and he can at least come in and play at a baseline level that doesn't ruin your offensive line. Where is Wyatt Davis? The Vikings drafted him in the 3rd round, and they haven't played him. I'm not even sure if he's going to make the roster or make the starting lineup on Sunday, even with an injury. Where is Chaz Surratt? He was a 3rd-round pick this year. He's really not done anything. I think Cameron Bynum has actually had some flashes, 4th-round safety this year. I think right now, I would say Cameron Bynum is the best defensive player Rick Spielman's drafted in 4 years. I'm actually quite confident in that. I mean, the competition is just like Cameron Dantzler, James Lynch, Troy Dye, Harrison Hand, Josh Metellus, Kenny Willekes. This really says a lot and probably shows the Vikings need a larger rebuild than some want to admit. They're not a deep roster anymore with a bunch of young talent. They're a flawed roster that is propped up by 2 really good receivers, an excellent running back, and a quarterback who is slightly above average, has his good games, and that is it. The Vikings aren't a great offense. Nothing will indicate that, but the offense is good enough to mask some of those problems. But the other problems are quite large at this point. I don't think Spielman's been drafting well. I don't think Zimmer and his staff have developed very well outside of the work Andre Patterson has done. And hey, some credit should be given, I think, for the development this year of KJ Osborne. You know, it's not weird when a receiver takes a leap in year 2, but it almost felt weird because the Vikings haven't seemed to develop players very well. It's usually been what you see is what you get. Justin Jefferson was good right away. Stefon Diggs was good right away. This team doesn't have as many success stories as you want to believe. Let me just go through the 1st-round picks in recent years, by the way. This year, Christian Darrisaw, left tackle, was hurt for much of training camp and took a few weeks before he was playing. He's been solid. I think that pick is working and might be Spielman's, not his best, because Jefferson's obviously fantastic, But that's one of his best first-round picks in quite some time, because the others were Jeff Gladney, Garrett Bradbury, Mike Hughes, Laquan Treadwell, Trey Waynes. And then you go all the way back to Anthony Barr and Teddy Bridgewater, and that was back in 2014. So the Vikings, at a time, drafted really well, and every year they seem to really draft in a way where most, like, in the draft community that make content and talk about the draft all the time always end up liking the Vikings draft picks. And then Zimmer never plays them as rookies, and a lot of times they turn out to just not be game-changing players. And we move on to the next draft. So I think it's just time. Like, the Vikings now have been mediocre for basically every year since 2017. That deep run almost got to the Super Bowl. They had one playoff season here so far and 4 tries with Kirk Cousins, who was supposed to come in and simply close the gap so Minnesota could get back to the NFC title game, beat it up great over Case Keenum. Other problems have showed up. Zimmer and Spielman, neither of them have fixed any of those holes. It's just time for something new in Minnesota. And I'm pretty confident that Zimmer is going to be out. I feel like Spielman is going to be out, but I'm not exactly sure because I think the Wilfs want to avoid too much sweeping change that could set the Vikings back even further. Like, they definitely don't want to be in a situation like the Jets or the Jaguars. And I think that that could lead them to trying to patch this team up again, because there are a few things that you can look at and say, yeah, the team isn't that far away. And even this year, I mean, if you just know how to finish out the first and second half, the Vikings can have 11 wins. But they constantly give up points before halftime. Zimmer really doesn't have the best strategies for approaching end-of-half situations, timeout usage, challenge usage. I think that he's probably just best as a defensive coordinator. And even then, I do have some issues, I think, with his defense for the modern day, because to me, the Zimmer defense is really good at getting you to third down, and that is kind of the key of the defense. They get aggressive on third down, but when you watch the Vikings play, you'll notice a lot of first downs. Teams will just get like an easy 4 to 6 yards because the Vikings are kind of giving that to you. Their entire philosophy seems to be, we just want to get you to third down. And I think Zimmer's really good on third down, and the Vikings consistently have a great third down defense. The problem is they give up big plays, can't stop the run, don't have defensive backs that play the football very well, and the game is so offensively skewed with every rule in the book and penalties that I think you have to have a different kind of scheme for the modern day. I'm not convinced that Zimmer's scheme, even with better talent, is optimal for the modern day NFL. I prefer schemes that are way more aggressive and maybe, they give up some big plays, but if you can get turnovers and sacks, that's what matters right now. Trying to force teams to punt will have you pulling your hair out with how many penalties can give the offense fresh life on a dead drive. Sacks and turnovers are your only way around that. And the Vikings have been a good pass rushing team. They dial up a lot of creative blitzes. And I love what Zimmer does on third down. I think it's the absolute best thing he does is dial up third down defenses. And it's so much fun to watch what he does with Eric Kendricks and Harrison Smith. And that's one of the things I would miss the most with Zimmer being gone. But it just isn't enough. With Mike Zimmer, you also get a very outdated offensive philosophy. His solution whenever anything goes wrong is running the football. He sounds exactly like Pete Carroll. They should be on the same staff when they probably both get fired this year. I gotta think both are out. He wants to run the football, and he wants to go play action off of it. But I think herein lies a big problem, and that's the offensive line drafted by Rick Spielman and put together by him hasn't been very good. And it's made a situation where Spielman and Zimmer just haven't been a good fit. Zimmer needs a GM who can better identify offensive line talent and does not miss the way Spielman has. The Vikings cannot be this dominant running play action team with their current guard and center situation. They've drafted some good tackles, and oftentimes going for the more athletic tackles is the right call these days. But I think when you get these smaller athletic interior linemen, you're just asking to be bulldozed time and time again. You better have a quarterback who can get outside the pocket. Vikings don't have that. Like, the Vikings have pieces of a good team. The problem is that these pieces do not go to the same puzzle at all. Kirk Cousins is a quarterback who can be pretty darn good and honestly has been for much of his time in Minnesota. Like, he's put together some impressive games. I think this year even he's been really good. Now, the Cleveland game, the Rams game, there are a few that I think stand out as being the performances that keep Kirk from being an upper tier quarterback. I don't think Cousins is a Super Bowl caliber quarterback. I do think he's a playoff caliber quarterback, especially when 7 teams in every conference make it. Cousins is not the reason the Vikings aren't a playoff team. Not at all this season. The problems go way beyond him. I know he played well enough the beginning of the year to start the season stronger. And, I mean, it's the defense that's blown a lot of these games late. The Carolina game is one that he had to save. The Pittsburgh game is one that he had to save as well. Hit that big throw downfield to KJ Osborne. But, yeah, there are games where Cousins plays really badly because he can't handle pressure all that well. I don't think he has the best pocket presence, pocket movement, doesn't throw that well under pressure. And he also seems to be a player who has trouble moving on from his mistakes. There's a constant battle, it seems, with the risk aversion that Cousins will show. There are games where he just does not want to throw downfield, and there are receivers open, but he's not throwing the ball. And then other games, I feel, where he's just like, all right, you want me to throw it deep? I'm going to throw it deep. And then they're like underthrown in the double coverage and somehow not intercepted. Then you go back to the Rams game. I'm going to be thinking about that check down, 3rd down in the red zone to Alexander Mattison for a long time because I can't understand why an NFL quarterback would make that throw. Cousins is a good quarterback, but there are just too many conditions that come with helping him get to that level, and it's not worth a $45 million salary cap hit next year. I have no idea what they're going to do with that. Actually, I have a pretty good idea. He's going to play next year for Minnesota. I do not think the Vikings are going to move on from Zimmer, Spielman, and Kirk Cousins. My idea is that the Wilfs are not going to see this as a situation that requires a full reset. I think for the Vikings to become a Super Bowl caliber team sooner than later, it's going to require a bit of a deeper rebuild. Like, you keep Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, Eric Kendricks, Harrison Smith, hopefully Danielle Hunter. There are a few veterans that I'd still want to keep around, but you've got to probably look at some other changes. Maybe Anthony Barr will go. See what happens here with the defensive tackles. What do you want to do with Michael Pierce, Dalvin Tomlinson? What do you do with Kirk Cousins? Maybe you end up trading him. But I don't see the Vikings going with an aggressive rebuild approach. I think what's going to happen here is they're going to want someone to be able to come in and assess what's wrong with this team right now, because it's not like the roster is terrible or the coaching is terrible, but the results have been so mediocre, and Zimmer and his staff have been here for so long. At this point, you just need a fresh perspective. Somebody outside the organization who maybe understands what winning franchises are made of to come in and say, this is the problem with this team. And that's going to be really fascinating to see what their strategy is with the head coach they end up hiring. And I think that's going to be very telling of their strategy, because I'm expecting them to be looking for more of a veteran that maybe has some winning experience. Like, I could totally see them going after like Doug Peterson. because he won a Super Bowl back in 2017. But I am expecting them to go for an offensive-minded coach. I think that's what most people want to do these days, because then at least if you have a good offense and a good offensive scheme, it's easier to keep together than watching your coordinator be hired away the next year. But ultimately, I don't really know who I want the next Vikings coach to be, because the qualities that make a great head coach, I don't think are visible to fans watching the games. Like, just to watch like offenses or defenses that play well and to take those coordinators, I mean, maybe sometimes. Like, it's really much more than just scheme. Like, I have so much respect for Mike Tomlin in Pittsburgh, and those teams, even if they're not great, they always play hard, they're always tough, and he's got this long stretch with no losing seasons. Like, I expect Tomlin to be there a long time, but if he were ever available, like, I would take Mike Tomlin over any coach that is out there right now that isn't currently a head coach, because I think that he has those important qualities that make a winning team and create a winning culture. But where this team is right now, I'm pretty confident they're going to go with an offensive head coach. Their last two coaches have been defensive-minded with Leslie Frazier and Mike Zimmer. So hopefully they do a little bit better than the Brad Childress hire this time around, and they can get someone who, you know, wants to embrace analytics and trends for the modern game and understands how to win in 2021 or 2022, not in 2003. Mike Zimmer was the right coach for Minnesota in 2014, and overall it's been a good run, but unfortunately the last 3 out of 4 years have really, I think, hurt a little bit of Zimmer's legacy in Minnesota, with no back-to-back playoff seasons and not really creating this winning culture that we hoped would come out of the 2017 playoff run. The Vikings are still the Vikings, man. They're still the team that I grew up watching overall. And I really hope they can find a head coach that can take them further than that, because it's not good enough. I think Zimmer has been a good coach overall, though, and the best coach they've had since Denny Green. But it's time for something new. And I hope that also comes with a new front office. And I like Rick Spielman. I expect he'll be in another front office if the Vikings do part ways with him. But at the end of the day, it's just time here for Minnesota. They need something new, something to get the fans to buy in. Like, when I grew up, I saw a lot of apathetic Vikings fans, older Vikings fans. And now I think I finally understand. This year, I wasn't excited watching the games. I didn't have a lot of fun outside of, like, the first Packer game. And I didn't really look forward to the games like I have in years past. And that's, I guess, something that's been building up over these last few years, is I just don't have the confidence. And it hasn't been as fun. And it's not just losing. It's when you factor in expectations and where the team should be in your eyes. And I just end up more so looking forward to watching Red Zone or big primetime games. And I'm still, like, stoked to watch the NFL playoffs. Like, I love playoff football, the one-game showdowns. I mean, there's nothing like it. You lose, doesn't matter how good your season was. If you're not ready on that one day, you're done. I think that is fantastic for sports. The NFL playoffs are the best, bar none. NCAA tournament's pretty good too. But I talked a lot about the team in general. I want to look through a few more things here on the roster. I'm not exactly done yet. There was at least one more thing I knew I wanted to complain about. At the end of training camp, the Vikings spent a 4th-round pick to trade for Chris Herndon. They got a 6th-round pick in return. But I think this simple transaction could also show the disconnect with the Vikings. This transaction right here is easy to overlook. But I think you can actually sum up a lot of where the Vikings are right now with this trade for Chris Herndon. At the time, I didn't really think it was a bad trade because they had just lost Irv Smith for the year and wanted to make sure they had a starting tight end. Herndon had some flashes back in 2018. He missed most of 2019. Wasn't super involved in the Jets offense a year ago and was probably on the roster bubble in camp. But the Vikings traded the 4th round pick to get him. And what ended up happening is that Tyler Conklin ended up being the Vikings starter, came in, and was at the very least an average NFL tight end, start to finish. Pretty good hands, but Tyler Conklin has had a solid year. And you're telling me that no one on the Vikings knew that he could be a solid starting tight end like that? He was drafted back in 2018. And they still traded a 4th round pick for Chris Herndon, who basically didn't play. He had 4 catches this year. Granted, Conklin didn't have a lot of receiving production in past years, but this was at the end of training camp, man. You were more confident in a player outside the organization who wasn't a proven starting tight end. And at the very least, this shows some disconnect there. Did the coaching staff think Conklin could be an average tight end? It's his 4th season. He got his first chance to start, and he had an average season. By all accounts, it was exactly what the Vikings needed when Irv Smith went down. Now Minnesota is missing a 4th round pick in the upcoming draft. Don't worry, though, they got 3 6th rounders right now. I just think that type of transaction shows that not everybody is on the same page. So I'm hoping there are a lot of changes here for the Vikings going forward. It's certainly time. They're going to enter the offseason with negative cap space, and that could lead to some difficult decisions. I don't know what's going to happen with Danielle Hunter. I don't know if they're going to be able to trade Kirk Cousins or if they would even want to. I am not totally convinced they want to get rid of Cousins. I'm guessing they're going to try and patch this up more than just tear it all down. But they got a lot of work to do if they're going to make that happen, and they need to have a good draft. It's been way too long, especially for the defensive side of the football. When I look at this roster and think about what it was a handful of years ago with the young defensive talent, they had 5 drafts to supplement it and have done nothing with those drafts. Very disappointing. I do think that there could be some teams that want to trade for Kirk Cousins, teams in the same situation as Minnesota, mediocre, middle of the pack. But at this point, I do think that Cousins is going to stay put, and we're going to have an offensive coach with the team next year and a new GM, and we'll have to see what happens. A lot of times, new regimes bring in a lot of change, and if the Wilfs that own the team want to be a little more controlling and say, no, we don't want a full-on teardown, could end up, not making the best hires and not really solving the problem. I'm worried about that happening. I'm already worried about the next regime that doesn't exist. I'm a real Viking fan. But I really hope they nail the head coaching hire and that it's a good move for the offense. This is now an offensive Vikings team, and they have to embrace that. But I suppose if that's the case as well, they're probably going to stay with Cousins, and you can't look at moving on from him until you have another plan on the roster. Or you trade for Tyler Huntley. He's been really fun to watch. But that is where I'm at right now with the Minnesota Vikings. Just as a whole right now, the pieces do not fit together. It's time for something new. I'm looking at the stats here. I can't believe that I haven't even talked about all the check downs, the CJ Ham. Yeah, there are some weird things this team does on offense. But hey, Justin Jefferson's been fantastic, and hopefully they can build an offense that he wants to stay part of, so he's not leaving like past superstars at wide receiver. What do you think about the Minnesota Vikings and what they should do this offseason? Let me know down below in the comment section. It was nice to give my thoughts here on the team. I think about this a lot, but now I can just prepare for the off season, the playoffs, and hopefully be entertained. Right now, my Super Bowl pick would probably be the Green Bay Packers. Hopefully, somebody can go into Lambeau there in the divisional round and take them out, and the playoffs can really be enjoyable after that. But that is going to do it for me today, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the video. Something different. Let me know what you thought, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.